The Westlake Files. Episode 1, The Hollow Man. Narrated by Dr. Chin. Disclaimer. Good evening. My name is Dr. Evelyn Chin. Before we begin, I need to make something very clear. The stories shared in the Westlake Files are inspired by real cases, but all names, locations, identifying details, and circumstances have been altered to protect client confidentiality. Some of the events discussed in this series involve trauma, violence, grief, criminal behavior, and disturbing psychological themes. Viewer discretion is advised. Tonight's story is not for children. It's not even for everyone. Because tonight's story is about what happens when grief is left to rot, and how revenge can become a religion. This is The Hollow Man. Introduction. Most people believe evil announces itself. They imagine monsters wearing monster faces. But in my years as a therapist, I've learned something different. The most dangerous people I've ever met weren't born monsters. They were created. Slowly. Painfully. One choice at a time. I met a man I'll call Michael. At the time he walked into my office, he was 42 years old. Neatly dressed. Soft-spoken. Polite. The kind of man you trust immediately. The kind of man you'd ask for directions. The kind of man who never raised his voice. Yet by the end of our sessions, I would come to understand something terrifying. Michael wasn't seeking healing. He wasn't seeking forgiveness. He was documenting a war. And he had spent 8 years winning it. Chapter 1, The Day Everything Died. Michael had been living what most people would call an ordinary life. A wife named Sarah. A newborn son named Noah. A small house. A stable career. Nothing extraordinary. Which made what happened next even more cruel. It was a Sunday afternoon. Sarah had taken Noah for a walk. The weather was perfect. The kind of day people remember forever. For Michael, it became the day time stopped. Across town, a 17-year-old named Brandon Hartley was driving a 6-figure sports car purchased by his father. Witnesses would later report he had been filming social media videos while driving. Others claimed he had been drinking. Some said he was racing another vehicle. No one ever agreed on the details. Because the details never mattered. Only the outcome. At 84 miles per hour, Brandon lost control. The vehicle jumped the curb. The stroller never had a chance. Neither did Sarah. Michael arrived at the hospital less than 30 minutes later. He never got to say goodbye. Chapter 2, The Second Funeral. Most people assume the funeral was the worst day of Michael's life. It was. The worst day came 3 months later. The trial. Michael described sitting in the courtroom, feeling hope for the first time since the accident. Hope that justice existed. Hope that consequences mattered. Hope that his wife and son meant something. Then he watched Brandon walk into court smiling. Laughing. Joking with friends. Not a trace of remorse. Not a trace of fear. The defense argued Brandon was a good student. A promising young man. An unfortunate victim of circumstance. The judge agreed. Probation. Community service. License suspension. No prison. No accountability. No justice. Michael told me something that chilled me. He said, "That was the day my family died. The accident just hadn't informed me yet." Chapter 3, The Birth of a Ghost. For nearly a year, Michael disappeared from the world. Friends stopped calling. Family moved on. Coworkers stopped asking if he was okay. But Michael wasn't healing. He was studying, researching, watching, learning. Not Brandon. Brandon was too easy. Michael became fascinated with Brandon's father. The billionaire developer. The man who seemed untouchable. The man Michael believed had purchased the outcome. The man he blamed for everything. And that obsession became a mission. A mission that would consume the next 8 years of his life. Michael's goal wasn't murder. According to him, death was mercy. No. He wanted something else. He wanted collapse. Slow. Complete. Irreversible. And he intended to achieve it from the shadows. Without ever being seen. Without ever being suspected. Without ever pulling a trigger. Chapter 4, The First Domino. The first move was so small nobody noticed. Not even the Hartleys. A leaked document. An anonymous email. A quiet tip sent to the right journalist. Then another. And another. One by one, old business deals resurfaced. Investigations opened. Partnerships fractured. Investors became nervous. The Hartley empire wasn't collapsing. Not yet. But cracks had begun to spread beneath the foundation. And Michael watched every single one. Like a gardener tending flowers. Only these flowers grew from hatred. Commentary. This is where many viewers expect me to tell you Michael was insane. That he had snapped. That he had become detached from reality. But that wasn't true. Michael was frighteningly rational. That's what made him dangerous. He wasn't acting out of impulse. He wasn't acting out of rage. He was acting out of purpose. Every move was calculated. Every decision was measured. Every year brought him closer to something he called balance. Not justice. Balance. And those are not the same thing. Not even close. End of part 1. What Michael didn't realize was that revenge changes shape over time. At first you hunt your enemy. Then you become dependent on the hunt. Then eventually, you forget who you were before it began. And by the time Michael understood that truth, there was no turning back. Because the next file in his collection would reveal something even darker. The Hartleys had secrets. Secrets far worse than corruption. Secrets that would transform a grieving husband into something else entirely. Something neither of us could have predicted. And that was only the beginning. Part 2, The Empire of SECRETS. Analysis. People often misunderstand revenge. They think it's driven by anger. But anger burns too hot. Too fast. What fuels long-term revenge is something colder. Purpose. When I reviewed Michael's journals, one thing became clear. He had stopped viewing himself as a victim. He viewed himself as an investigator. A historian. A man documenting a sickness. And in his mind, the Hartley family was the disease. Chapter 5, The Mask. For nearly 18 months, Michael watched. He studied every interview. Every business appearance. Every social media post. Every public filing. To the outside world, Richard Hartley was a self-made billionaire. A philanthropist. A devoted father. A pillar of the community. The kind of man politicians posed beside. The kind of man charities celebrated. But Michael had learned something important. The louder someone advertises their virtue, the more terrified they are of what happens if the truth escapes. And Richard Hartley was terrified. Chapter 6, The Other Life. The first crack appeared unexpectedly. A private investigator Michael hired discovered repeated trips to locations that made no sense. Every Tuesday. Every Friday. Same times. Same route. No security detail. No assistance. No driver. Richard disappeared for hours. Michael initially suspected another family. Another woman. A hidden child. The reality was stranger. Richard had been battling a severe addiction for years. An addiction hidden from shareholders, employees, and even most of his family. Money had insulated him. Protected him. allowed him to hide behaviors that would have destroyed anyone else. But addiction leaves fingerprints, and Michael began collecting them. Receipts, photographs, medical records, witness statements, patterns, thousands of tiny pieces, none meaningful alone, devastating together. Chapter 7, The Woman in the House. Then Michael discovered Evelyn Hartley, Richard's wife, someone the public almost never saw. Officially, she preferred privacy. Officially, she disliked attention. Officially, she stayed out of the spotlight. Officially, the truth was darker. According to household staff, Evelyn rarely left the estate. Her finances were controlled. Her communications monitored. Her movements restricted. Years of emotional manipulation had transformed a mansion into a prison. Not one with bars. One with fear. Michael became obsessed with her. Not romantically. Strategically. Because for the first time, he saw another victim. Someone trapped inside the same machine that had protected Brandon. Someone who knew where the bodies were buried. Metaphorically. Perhaps literally. Analysis. This was the first time Michael's mission changed. Originally, he wanted destruction. Now he wanted exposure. There's a difference. Destruction is emotional. Exposure is surgical. And surgery requires patience. Michael was becoming patient in ways that frightened me. Because patience is what separates an angry man from a dangerous one. Chapter 8, The Son. The more Michael investigated Richard, the more he learned about Brandon, the spoiled teenager who had become a young man. Brandon wasn't improving. He wasn't remorseful. He wasn't rebuilding his life. He was becoming his father. Arrests vanished. Incidents disappeared. Witnesses changed stories. Problems evaporated. Money solved everything. Again. And again. And again. Michael wrote a single sentence in his journal. A sentence he later read aloud during therapy. I remember every word. His father taught him consequences are negotiable. Chapter 9, The Blue Folder. By year 3, Michael possessed enough information to ruin Richard Hartley. Enough evidence to trigger investigations. Enough secrets to collapse reputations. Enough leverage to ignite scandals. But he didn't act. Not yet. Instead, he created what he called the Blue Folder. One folder. One master collection. Every secret. Every recording. Every photograph. Every document. The complete anatomy of an empire. He kept it locked away. Waiting. Growing. Like a bomb with no timer. Because Michael had reached a terrifying conclusion. Destroying Richard wasn't enough. Richard needed to watch everything disappear first. His company. His reputation. His allies. His son's future. Only then would the punishment begin. And Michael was willing to wait years. End of part 2. When Michael left my office that evening, he paused at the door. Then he asked a question that still haunts me. He said, Dr. Chin, if a man spends years becoming a monster to destroy another monster, who wins? I didn't have an answer then. And after what happened next, I'm not sure I have one now. Because the next phase of Michael's plan wouldn't target Richard Hartley's business. It would target his family. And once that began, there would be no way back. Part 3, The Ghost in the Walls. Analysis. There is a moment in some trauma survivors where justice stops being the objective. The original wound becomes impossible to heal. The loss cannot be undone. The dead do not return. And so the mind quietly changes the question. It no longer asks, how do I move forward? Instead it asks, how do I make them feel what I felt? That is where Michael had arrived. Not at justice. At equivalence. And equivalence can become an obsession. Chapter 10, Evelyn. Michael first met Evelyn Hartley at a charity event. She looked exactly as she did in magazine photos. Elegant. Composed. Untouchable. But Michael noticed something the cameras never captured. Exhaustion. The kind that settles deep behind the eyes. The kind that comes from years of carrying secrets. Over the next several months, their paths crossed again and again. Never suspiciously. Never intentionally. At least not from Evelyn's perspective. Eventually, conversations became easier. Longer. More personal. Michael listened far more than he spoke. That was his gift. People rarely noticed how much they revealed when someone simply listened. And Evelyn revealed plenty. Not crimes. Not evidence. Something far more valuable. Fear. Chapter 11, The Ledger. By the 4th year of his investigation, Michael understood something important. Richard Hartley's greatest weakness wasn't scandal. It wasn't reputation. It wasn't even addiction. It was money. Everything Richard loved connected back to money. Power. Influence. Control. Status. Money was the foundation beneath every pillar of his life. And foundations can crack. Slowly. Quietly. Then all at once. Michael began collecting information. Not because he intended to hand it to authorities. Not because he believed the system would save him. The system had already failed him once. No. Michael wanted something else. He wanted Richard awake at 3 a.m, wondering, panicking, questioning everyone around him, wondering who knew, wondering who was watching, wondering what would happen next. Analysis. This was the phase I found most disturbing. Michael no longer spoke about Sarah. Or Noah. Not often. The names appeared less and less in his journals. Instead, there were spreadsheets, timelines, plans, contingencies. The mission had become larger than the loss. And that's a dangerous transformation. Because eventually revenge stops serving grief. Grief starts serving revenge. Chapter 12, The First Message. The first message arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Richard received it alone. No signature. No threats. No demands. Just a sentence. A sentence that should have been impossible. A sentence referring to a secret only a handful of people knew. Michael would later describe the moment as an experiment. He wanted to know whether Richard could still feel fear. The answer came quickly. According to sources close to the family, Richard canceled meetings, missed calls, fired 2 employees, ordered internal audits. For weeks he searched for a leak that didn't exist. Because the truth was much worse. The enemy wasn't inside his company. The enemy was standing outside the walls. Watching. Waiting. Smiling. Chapter 13, Collateral Damage. What Michael didn't anticipate was the effect his campaign would have on everyone else. Employees feared layoffs. Investors feared scandal. Family members turned suspicious of one another. Even Evelyn became increasingly anxious. The Hartley household transformed into a pressure cooker. And pressure always finds an escape. One evening, Evelyn asked Michael a question. A simple question. A heartbreaking question. She asked, "Do you think some people deserve what's coming to them?" Michael told me he didn't answer. Because he wasn't sure whether she was talking about Richard. Or himself. Chapter 14, The Mirror. During one of our final sessions, I asked Michael something he clearly hadn't considered. I asked, "Suppose you succeed." He looked at me silently. So I continued. Suppose Richard loses everything. Suppose Brandon loses everything. Suppose every single thing you've planned works exactly as intended. Still silence. Then I asked the only question that mattered. What happens the next day? For the first time since I'd met him, Michael didn't have an answer. Because revenge stories always focus on the destruction. They rarely discuss what comes after. The emptiness, the silence, the absence of purpose. And I believe, in that moment, Michael finally saw it. The possibility that after years of hunting monsters, he might discover there was nothing left of himself. End of part 3. The next file would reveal a shocking truth. Richard Hartley had finally realized someone was targeting him. He just didn't know who. And when powerful men become frightened, they don't hide. They hunt. What followed would transform a one-sided revenge campaign into a war. And wars have casualties. Chapter 15, The Anniversary. 8 years had passed since Sarah and Noah died. 8 years since Michael's life ended and somehow continued at the same time. Every year he followed the same ritual. No exceptions. No excuses. He visited the cemetery alone. No family. No friends. No flowers. Just silence. Michael told me he preferred it that way. Because grief was the only thing left that still belonged to him. The cemetery sat on a quiet hill overlooking the city. From there he could see the skyline, the office towers, the highways, and the neighborhoods. Millions of people moving through lives that continued uninterrupted. A world that hadn't noticed 2 people were missing. Michael stood before the headstones for nearly an hour. Not speaking. Not crying. Just staring. Sarah. Noah. The 2 names that had once been his entire world. Then something happened. Not a revelation. Not an epiphany. Something worse. A realization. Michael had spent years hunting Richard Hartley, studying him, documenting him, dismantling pieces of his empire, obsessing over his secrets. And standing there, looking at the graves of his wife and son, Michael understood something that made him physically sick. He had stopped thinking about Brandon, the boy who had been behind the wheel, the boy who had killed them and walked away. For years, Michael had convinced himself Richard was the true target. The architect, the protector, the man who corrupted justice. But Brandon had faded into the background. And for the first time in years, Michael asked himself a simple question. What had become of him? Analysis. Trauma rarely moves in a straight line. People assume obsession is focused. In reality, it wanders. It attaches itself to symbols, ideas, and easier targets. Richard Hartley had become a symbol for Michael. A representation of everything he hated. Power, privilege, corruption, control. But symbols are safer than reality. Reality forces us to confront the original wound. And Brandon was that wound. The young man whose actions had destroyed a family and then continued living as though nothing had happened. I believe Michael avoided looking too closely at Brandon for years. Because part of him still wanted to believe the accident had changed him. That somewhere beneath the arrogance there was guilt. Remorse. Humanity. What Michael discovered instead would reignite everything. Chapter 16, The Boy Who Never Grew Up. The first thing Michael learned was that Brandon Hartley was no longer a boy. He was 25 years old. The second thing he learned was far more disturbing. Brandon hadn't changed. Not really. The sports cars were still there. The parties were still there. The headlines were still there. Only now there were lawyers, assistants, and executives cleaning up behind him. Just like Richard, Michael spent months quietly observing, watching from a distance, studying patterns. And the more he watched, the more uncomfortable he became. Because Brandon wasn't living in the shadow of his father. He was becoming him. Employees feared him. Friends enabled him. Strangers admired him. Consequences avoided him. Again and again, the same story repeated itself. The same protection. The same entitlement. The same belief that money could solve anything. Then Michael found something he couldn't stop thinking about. A recording. Years old. A private conversation. Brandon speaking to friends. Laughing. Joking. Talking about the accident. Michael listened once. Then twice. Then 20 times. According to Michael, one sentence stood out. One sentence that echoed in his head for weeks. Dad handled it. Not regret. Not sorrow. Not guilt. Just confidence. Confidence that someone else had cleaned up the mess. Just as they always had. Michael told me that was the moment everything changed. Not because Brandon confessed to anything new, but because Michael finally understood something. The accident wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy was what happened afterward. A boy had learned he could take a life and continue living exactly as before. And now that boy was preparing to inherit an empire. Chapter 17, The Successor. Richard Hartley wasn't building a company anymore. He was building a legacy. And Brandon was the heir. Board meetings. Investor introductions. Leadership training. Public appearances. Every move suggested the same future. One day Richard would step aside. And Brandon would take his place. Michael stared at photographs from one of Brandon's corporate events. A room full of executives applauding. Smiling. Celebrating. As if they were witnessing the future. And perhaps they were. The future Michael had spent 8 years trying to prevent. That night, he opened the blue folder. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at Richard's name. He was looking at Brandon's. And as he sat alone in the darkness, a thought entered his mind. A thought that frightened even him. Maybe Richard Hartley wasn't the final chapter. Maybe Richard had only ever been the gatekeeper. Maybe Brandon was the real ending. And if that was true, everything Michael had done so far was only the beginning. Chapter 18, Evelyn. Michael never intended to become part of Evelyn Hartley's life. At least, that's what he told me. The original plan had been simple. Gain her trust. Learn what she knew. Move on. Another source. Another piece of the puzzle. Nothing more. But life rarely follows plans. And neither does loneliness. Over the course of a year, their conversations became routine. Coffee became dinners. Dinners became long walks. Long walks became something neither of them wanted to define. For the first time in nearly a decade, Michael found himself sharing pieces of himself again. Not the investigation. Not the revenge. The real parts. The grief. The memories. The man he had been before everything was taken from him. And Evelyn listened. Analysis. One of the most dangerous lies we tell ourselves is that we can use people without becoming attached to them. Human beings are not evidence. They are not leverage. They are not tools. Yet Michael had spent years viewing everyone through the lens of his mission. Informants. Witnesses. Obstacles. Targets. Evelyn was the first person who disrupted that way of thinking. Which created a problem. Because caring about someone complicates revenge. Chapter 19, The Confession. One evening, Evelyn confessed something to Michael. Not a crime. Not a secret. A fear. She was afraid of what would happen when Brandon inherited everything. Afraid of the kind of man he was becoming. Afraid that Richard had spent years protecting him from consequences. Afraid that one day the entire empire would belong to someone even worse. Michael listened quietly, because for the first time, someone inside the Hartley family was saying exactly what he had spent years believing. The difference was that Evelyn still hoped Brandon could change. Michael didn't. Not anymore. Chapter 20, The Cost. During one of our sessions, I asked Michael whether he loved Evelyn. He stared at me for a long time. Long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said something I'll never forget. I wish I didn't. Because loving Evelyn created a problem he hadn't anticipated. His plans for Richard would hurt her. His plans for Brandon would hurt her even more. And yet he continued moving forward. Not because he hated Evelyn, but because he had convinced himself there was no other choice. That is the tragedy of obsession. Eventually, it asks for sacrifices, then demands them, then makes them seem reasonable. And Michael had already sacrificed too much to stop. At least, that's what he told himself. End of chapter. What Michael didn't know was that Evelyn had secrets of her own. Secrets she had never shared with Richard. Secrets she had never shared with Brandon. And one of those secrets was about to change everything. Because while Michael believed he was using Evelyn to get closer to the Hartleys, Evelyn had begun investigating them herself. Part 4, The Woman in the House. Chapter 21, The Things We Don't Say. People imagine secrets are hidden in vaults, locked away behind steel doors and encrypted hard drives. In my experience, the most dangerous secrets live in plain sight. At dinner tables, in family photos, inside marriages. Michael had spent years studying the Hartley family from the outside. What he failed to realize was that the person who understood Richard Hartley best wasn't a business partner. It wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't an investigator. It was Evelyn, the woman sleeping beside him every night. Analysis. Relationships built on deception are fascinating. Not because they fail, because sometimes they succeed. Michael entered Evelyn's life with an agenda. He wanted information, access, insight. He told himself she was a source, a means to an end. But human beings are rarely that simple. The longer he stayed, the more difficult it became to separate the mission from the person. And that was a problem, because obsession doesn't like complications. It views attachment as weakness. Chapter 22, CRACKS in the Glass. The first time Evelyn questioned Michael was subtle. A look, a pause, a question that lingered a little too long. How do you know so much about Richard? Michael laughed it off, changed the subject, moved on. But Evelyn noticed. She always noticed. Years spent surviving Richard Hartley had sharpened her instincts. She knew when people were hiding things, because she had spent most of her life hiding things herself. And for the first time, she began watching Michael the way Michael watched everyone else. Quietly, patiently, without him realizing it. Chapter 23, The Box. 3 weeks later, Evelyn made a decision. A decision she had delayed for nearly 15 years. She opened a locked wooden box hidden in the back of a closet. Inside were journals, documents, old flash drives, photographs, notes, thousands of moments collected over years. Not because she planned to expose Richard, because she needed proof she wasn't imagining things. Proof that the lies had happened. Proof that the manipulation was real. Proof that the version of reality Richard sold to the world wasn't the truth. For years, she had been documenting the Hartleys. Not as evidence, as survival. And now, staring at the contents of that box, she wondered if she had been preparing for this moment all along. Chapter 24, The Confession. It happened during a rainstorm. Michael would remember every detail. The sound of water against the windows. The silence between sentences. The look on Evelyn's face. She asked him a question. A simple question. Why did you really come into my life? For the first time in years, Michael found himself unable to lie. Perhaps he was tired. Perhaps he was guilty. Or perhaps he simply trusted her. Whatever the reason, he told her. Not everything, but enough. Sarah. Noah. The accident. The trial. The years that followed. The obsession. The grief. When he finished speaking, neither of them said a word. Evelyn sat perfectly still, trying to process what she had heard. Because for the first time, she understood what Richard had protected Brandon from. Not a lawsuit. Not a scandal. The consequences of destroying a family. And suddenly, years of half-truths began making sense. Analysis. People often imagine truth sets us free. Sometimes it does. Other times it traps us. Because once Evelyn learned the truth, she could no longer pretend ignorance. She was no longer standing outside the story. She had become part of it. And that terrified her. Chapter 25, The Recording. 2 days later, Evelyn arrived carrying a small envelope. No explanation. No warning. She placed it on the table. Michael stared at it. What's this? Her answer changed everything. Something you should hear. Inside was a flash drive. A recording. Years old. Recorded less than 24 hours after the accident. The voices were unmistakable. Richard. Lawyers. Consultants. Advisors. No grief. No remorse. No discussion of the lives that had been lost. Only strategy. Risk. Exposure. Public relations. Damage control. The recording didn't prove a crime. It proved something else. A mindset. A willingness to treat tragedy like an inconvenience. Michael listened to it 3 times. Then 4. Then 5. Each replay stripping away another piece of whatever restraint remained. For 8 years, he had searched for answers. For 8 years, he had searched for proof. And now it sat in the palm of his hand. Given freely by the one person he never expected to trust him. Chapter 26, The Recognition. A week later, Evelyn said something that unsettled Michael. Something nobody had ever said before. I think you're becoming like him. Michael laughed. At first. Then he realized she wasn't joking. Richard controlled people. Michael manipulated them. Richard justified everything in the name of protecting his family. Michael justified everything in the name of avenging his. Richard believed the ends justified the means. Increasingly. So did Michael. For the first time in years, someone had forced him to look in a mirror. And he didn't like what he saw. Chapter 27, The Heir. Then Brandon made a mistake. A small mistake. The kind powerful people assume nobody notices. But Michael noticed. Brandon had begun positioning himself to take over portions of the company. Board meetings. Investor presentations. Media appearances. The future Richard Hartley. The next generation. The next untouchable man. And staring at those photographs, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not anger. Not hatred. Certainty. Everything always came back to Brandon. The accident. The cover-up. The lies. The grief. The obsession. The entire story began with him. And if Michael intended to end the Hartley legacy once and for all, he knew exactly where the final chapter would have to begin. End of part 4. What Michael didn't know was that Richard Hartley had finally become aware of the ghost haunting his life. Not who it was. Not why. Only that someone was there. Watching. Waiting. pulling invisible strings. And powerful men can tolerate many things: failure, embarrassment, even fear. But they cannot tolerate losing control. The war Michael had spent 8 years fighting in secret was about to become visible. And once both sides stepped into the light, someone was going to get hurt. Part 5. When GHOSDS Become Visible. Chapter 28. The Feeling. Richard Hartley couldn't explain it. At first, it was just a feeling. A subtle discomfort. A sense that something was wrong. Then came the sleepless nights. The second guessing. The paranoia. For months, small things had been happening around him. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing obvious. Yet somehow, every incident left the same impression. Someone knew too much. Someone was getting closer. Someone was watching. Richard had spent decades controlling every room he entered. Every negotiation. Every conversation. Every person. Control was his oxygen. And for the first time in years, he felt himself losing it. Analysis. Power changes people. Not because it makes them fearless. Because it convinces them they are safe. People who spend years insulated from consequences begin believing they are untouchable. The problem comes when reality reminds them otherwise. Richard Hartley wasn't afraid of exposure. He was afraid of uncertainty. He couldn't see the threat. And human beings fear invisible dangers more than visible ones. Chapter 29. The Hunters. Richard hired investigators. Former law enforcement. Corporate security specialists. Private intelligence firms. People whose entire careers revolved around finding hidden enemies. The results frustrated him. Nothing. No suspects. No obvious leaks. No competitors. No disgruntled partners. Every trail ended in silence. Every question led nowhere. Because Richard was searching for someone who wasn't motivated by money. Or politics. Or business. He was searching for grief. And grief doesn't leave predictable footprints. Chapter 30. Evelyn's Warning. Evelyn noticed the change immediately. Richard was becoming agitated. Short-tempered. Suspicious. Watching everyone. Trusting no one. One evening she found Michael sitting alone. Thinking. Planning. Obsessing. Just as he always did. And for the first time, she felt genuinely afraid. Not of Richard. Of Michael. How far are you willing to go? The question caught him off guard. To do what? Finish this. Michael didn't answer. Because the truth had become difficult to articulate. Years earlier, the answer would have been simple. Now it was. The lines had blurred. The mission had evolved. The destination remained clear. But the road leading there had become darker than he ever intended. Chapter 31. The Presentation. Several weeks later, Brandon delivered a major presentation to investors. A public debut. The future face of the Hartley Empire. Michael watched the broadcast alone. And what he saw disturbed him. Not because Brandon performed poorly. The opposite. Brandon was charismatic. Confident. Articulate. Investors loved him. The board loved him. The media loved him. For the first time, Michael understood the real danger. Brandon wasn't some reckless rich kid anymore. He was becoming powerful. The same arrogance. The same entitlement. The same lack of accountability. Wrapped in a more polished package. And that realization terrified him. Because if Brandon succeeded, everything Richard built would survive. Analysis. People often imagine revenge as backward-looking. Focused on the past. Michael's was. His obsession had evolved. He no longer viewed Brandon solely as the man responsible for destroying his family. He viewed him as a threat to the future. Whether that belief was rational is another question entirely. But by that point, Michael wasn't measuring his decisions through reason. He was measuring them through loss. Chapter 32, The File. One night, Michael opened the blue folder again. 8 years of work. Thousands of pages. Hundreds of recordings. Photographs. Timelines. Connections. Enough material to expose countless lies. He sat alone staring at the screen. Then something unexpected happened. He closed it. Not because he was finished. Because he realized something. The evidence wasn't the objective. It never had been. The objective was Brandon. Everything else was preparation. Richard. The company. The secrets. The scandals. They were obstacles. Brandon was the destination. The realization should have frightened him. Instead, it brought clarity. And clarity can be dangerous. Chapter 33, The Meeting. Several days later, Richard finally made a discovery. A photograph. Nothing remarkable. Just an image taken at a charity event years earlier. Evelyn, standing beside Michael, smiling. Most people would have ignored it. Richard didn't. He stared at the photograph for nearly 10 minutes. Something about it bothered him. A feeling. An instinct. The same instinct that had helped him build an empire. He ordered a background investigation. Immediately. Within 48 hours, his investigators returned with a name. Michael. For the first time in 8 years, Richard Hartley was looking directly at the man who hated him most. He just didn't know why. Yet. Chapter 34, The Ghost Finds a Face. Michael received the warning through Evelyn. Richard was asking questions. Digging. Searching. Getting closer. The invisible war was ending. The shadows were disappearing. Sooner or later, Richard would learn who he was. Sooner or later, he'd learn about Sarah. About Noah. About the accident. About everything. And once that happened, there would be no pretending. No hiding. No second chances. The war would become personal. Analysis. During our final sessions, Michael spoke less and less about revenge. He spoke about inevitability. As though events were already decided. As though he were simply walking a path that had been laid before him years ago. That mindset concerned me. Because when people stop believing they have choices, they become capable of almost anything. End of part 5. The next chapter would begin with a confrontation. Not between Michael and Brandon. Not yet. Between Michael and Richard. Two men connected by a tragedy neither could escape. One had spent years protecting his son. The other had spent years preparing to destroy him. And standing between them was Evelyn. The only person who still believed this story could end without another life being ruined. She was wrong. Part 6, The Cost of Vengeance. Chapter 35, The Recognition. Richard Hartley learned the truth on a Tuesday. A single file landed on his desk. A photograph. A name. A history. Michael. Widower. Father. Victim. The pieces aligned instantly. For nearly a decade, Richard had searched for a ghost. Now the ghost had a face. And a reason. For a long time, Richard sat alone in his office staring at the photograph. Then he did something Michael never expected. He requested a meeting. Chapter 36, Two Fathers. The meeting took place in an empty office building after midnight. No lawyers. No security. No witnesses. Just two men. Michael had imagined this moment for years. Yet when it finally arrived, neither man spoke for nearly a minute. Richard looked older, smaller, human. Michael hated that. Monsters were easier. Finally, Richard broke the silence. I know who you are. Michael nodded. I assumed eventually you would. You spent 8 years doing this. Yes. Richard studied him, then asked a question. Not an accusation. A question. Did it help? Michael didn't answer. Because he wasn't sure. Analysis. People often fantasize about confronting the person responsible for their suffering. What they don't imagine is disappointment. Reality rarely delivers the emotional release we expect. The confrontation doesn't erase the trauma. The apology doesn't resurrect the dead. The truth doesn't undo the damage. Michael had reached the summit of the mountain he'd been climbing for 8 years. And from the top, the view was empty. Chapter 37, The Sun. 3 days later, Brandon finally learned everything. Not the details. The existence of Michael. The years of obsession. The investigation. The campaign. The reason. For the first time in his life, Brandon was forced to sit with something money couldn't immediately remove. Consequences. Michael expected fear. Instead, he saw confusion. Because Brandon barely remembered Sarah's name. Barely remembered Noah's. To Brandon, the accident was history. A chapter. A problem solved years ago. Michael realized something horrifying. For 8 years, he had centered his entire existence around a moment that Brandon had almost forgotten. Chapter 38, Evelyn's Choice. The breaking point came a week later. Evelyn arranged a meeting. Michael, Richard, Brandon. One room. No secrets. No lies. No hiding. Everyone finally looking at one another. The atmosphere felt suffocating. Years of pain compressed into a single moment. Brandon avoided eye contact. Richard looked exhausted. Michael looked hollow. And Evelyn looked angry. Not frightened. Not emotional. Angry. Because she finally understood something neither man had. Neither of them were fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting for ownership of the past. And everyone around them was paying the price. Including her. Chapter 39, The Question. Evelyn turned toward Brandon. What do you remember? The room fell silent. Brandon swallowed hard. Then spoke. At first quietly. Then louder. The words stumbled out. Not excuses. Not denials. Memories. The crash. The hospital. The trial. The fear. The shame. The years pretending it never happened. The years convincing himself it wasn't his fault. The years trying not to think about it. And for the first time since the beginning of the story, Michael saw something he never expected. Remorse. Not because Brandon suddenly became a good person. Because he finally stopped running. Analysis. Trauma freezes people. But guilt does too. The difference is that guilt often disguises itself as arrogance. As avoidance. As denial. For years, Michael assumed Brandon felt nothing. What if he was wrong? Not entirely wrong. Just incomplete. Human beings rarely fit into the roles we assign them. Victim. Villain. Hero. Monster. Reality is messier. And messier truths are often harder to accept. Chapter 40, The Hollow Man. During our final session, Michael told me something I'll never forget. He said, I thought revenge would feel heavier. I asked him what he meant. He stared out the window for a long time. Then he said, I spent 8 years carrying it. I thought when I finally put it down I'd feel different. What did you feel? His answer was immediate. Nothing. Not satisfaction. Not victory. Not peace. Nothing. Because revenge had become his identity. His purpose. His structure. His reason for waking up every morning. And once it was over, there was only silence. Chapter 41, The Visit. Several months later, Michael returned to the cemetery. The same hill. The same skyline. The same 2 headstones. Sarah. Noah. The wind moved gently through the trees. For a long time, he stood there saying nothing. Then finally he spoke. Not to the dead. To himself. I miss you. Not justice. Not revenge. Not Richard. Not Brandon. Not the years. Just them. The people underneath the stone. The people who had been lost. The people he had spent so long trying to avenge that he'd forgotten how to mourn. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Michael cried. Not from rage. Not from hatred. From grief. Pure grief. The kind he should have felt years earlier. The kind he'd buried beneath obsession. The kind that had been waiting patiently for him to stop running. Final analysis. People often ask me if Michael got justice. I don't know. Justice is a legal term. A philosophical term. A moral term. But it is not a therapeutic one. The question I ask is different. Did Michael heal? And the answer is complicated. Because healing did not begin when he exposed secrets, or confronted Richard, or faced Brandon. It began when he finally admitted something he had spent years avoiding. That revenge and grief are not the same thing. One distracts. The other remains. Waiting. Patiently. Until we're finally willing to face it. Closing. My name is Dr. Chin. The names and identifying details in this story have been changed to protect client confidentiality. But the emotions are real. The grief is real. And the lesson is real. Sometimes the most dangerous prisons are the ones we build ourselves. And sometimes the key has been in our pocket the entire time. This has been another entry from The Westlake Files.